He looked at me as if time hadn't passed. But I knew. Every year lived away from that town was there, trapped in the depths of his eyes, hidden behind the guarded expression he wore like armor. I had promised myself I'd never return. After. What happened after the way it all ended? After the way I was ripped from his life like a page torn from a Bible, without protest, without explanation. But there I was, standing again on the sidewalk of the church where I spent half my childhood, feeling the hard ground under my feet and the weight of memory piling onto my shoulders. My father was ill, and no matter how many years I'd spent trying to build a life not defined by him, it took just one call from my mother, her voice trembling and hesitant, to make me pack my bags. Returning was like diving into a shattered mirror. Every corner held a reflection of something I'd left behind. Innocence, fear, love, especially love. Isaac, my first, my most intense, my impossible. The carpenter's son, the boy who read psalms with reverence and kissed me behind. The altar as if each kiss were both a sin and a prayer. We loved in silence, in secret, between verses and promises, until we were discovered, until my father's harsh words echoed through the house like divine judgment. I was sent away. He stayed. And before I left, he told me, with wet eyes and clenched fists, that he'd never speak my name again, that he'd make a vow to forget as if I'd never existed. Now, years later, there he was, standing at the grocery store door, looking at me with the same eyes, but a silent soul. And I understood. He remembered. God knows he remembered. And though my heart screamed, my feet moved steadily as if nothing in me trembled. But I was trembling, because no one forgets what was taken by force, and no one buries a love like that without leaving a part of themselves behind. The first week was a constant exercise in restraint. Every place I entered, every person who greeted me, every quick glance averted in silence, carried an invisible weight that settled on my shoulders, making it hard to breathe. My parents' house still smelled of polished wood and freshly brewed coffee, but everything felt more fragile, as if time had been crueler here than to me. My father, now lying in the armchair where he once preached Sunday sermons, seemed smaller, folded in on himself, yet still imposing, because guilt, even dormant, still has a voice. I avoided mentioning Isaac, and they, perhaps out of strategy or shame, pretended he'd never been part of our story. But he was everywhere. He was there when I passed the workshop on the corner, when I entered the church and saw the stained glass he'd restored as a teenager, or when some woman from the congregation said, "You're prettier than when you left." I knew what that meant. Prettier, but still marked. Prettier, but not forgotten. Prettier, but still hers, the pastor's daughter who fell into temptation. Isaac, for his part, was different. He was no longer the broad-shouldered boy with burning eyes who waited for me after choir rehearsals. Now there was a stiffness in the way he walked, as if each step were measured. He didn't avoid looking at me, but he didn't approach either. Our eyes met in the market aisles, in the pharmacy line, even on the church sidewalk, where he now seemed to have some role. I wasn't sure what exactly. Maybe caretaker, maybe counselor, maybe just a man who stayed. What unsettled me most wasn't his presence, but his lack of reaction. I wanted to find anger or irony in that face, anything that betrayed a feeling still lingering beneath the surface. But he just looked at me and turned away, and that hurt more than any harsh word, because I didn't know if it was pride or protection. But then it happened. A gesture, small, quick, and all the more impossible to ignore because of it. We were at the church for a community council meeting, and as I approached the door with a stack of folders in my hands, it swung open suddenly. I stumbled, and before I could regain my balance, a firm hand caught my elbow. It was him. And in that brief contact, between the warmth of his skin and the jolt of his touch, everything came rushing back. Not the words, but the feeling, that deep recognition that doesn't depend on time or logic. It was as if my body knew before I did. He pulled back quickly, as if he'd broken an invisible rule, and I pretended not to notice. But I noticed, and in that silent moment, I understood that the vow he'd made to forget me had already failed, and maybe that was why he walked, as if carrying a weight heavier than his body could bear. Because forgetting someone who still lives inside you isn't a vow, it's a prison. That night, as I walked alone through the nearly empty streets, my shoes making a dry sound against the asphalt, I felt something inside me unravel slowly. It wasn't exactly pain. It was as if I were untying a knot I'd kept tight for too many years. A gesture, just a touch on my arm, and yet everything in me reacted as if I'd heard an old whisper from a time when I still believed loving someone was enough. When I got home, my mother was waiting with a cup of lukewarm tea and the tired eyes of someone who wanted to ask but knew she shouldn't. She didn't say his name. She never does. She talks of past matters in a hushed tone, as if the story that lived between me and Isaac were a stain on the pristine rugs of our morality. But even she noticed, because there was something different in me, something time couldn't erase, only put to sleep. In the days that followed, I started noticing the cracks, the way Isaac avoided me and at the same time sought me out with, the corner of his eyes, the way he gripped his tools in the workshop tighter when I passed by, and especially the way his silence spoke. It was a heavy, pained silence, full of things unsaid, and I understood, because mine was the same. Each time we crossed paths, it was as if a new layer of the past emerged between us. The afternoons in the old shed, the stolen kisses after choir rehearsals, the notes hidden in the hymnal pages. It was all still there, not as memory, but as truth, a truth that endured, a truth that neither time, scandal, nor religion could fully bury. I started waiting for the chance encounters. I began folding church flyers more slowly, passing through the square at the same times, watching his reflection in the shop windows on Main Street. And he gave in too, even if he wouldn't admit it. He sat closer at meetings, asked questions only I could answer, complimented my organization with a steady voice but unsteady eyes. It was all so subtle, yet so loud, that the town noticed before we did. The looks came as they always do, veiled comments, smiles too restrained, and then the right words in the wrong ears. It was on a Sunday afternoon that the warning came, almost like a threat disguised as advice. Ariane, be careful not to repeat the same mistakes. I didn't respond. I just smiled with the corner of my mouth and held my Bible tight against my chest, because for the first time in years, I didn't feel I'd been wrong to love him. The mistake was them tearing us apart, and if he was still there, even if he wouldn't say it, maybe it was time to ask if he still loved me too, or if he was just keeping a vow that no longer made sense, because love, when silenced by force, never dies. It just waits. And I felt his was waiting for me, as I had waited for him. The words no one spoke began to weigh more than any sermon preached from the pulpit. No matter how hard I tried to keep my composure, maintain appearances, stay calm, inside, I was all turbulence. And so was he. I started seeing him more often at church activities, not by chance, but by some inevitable pull, as if our souls knew the way to each other, even if our bodies tried to resist. During a community drive to organize donations, we worked side by side for nearly an hour. We talked only about boxes, labels, and dates, but the way our hands brushed by accident, the way our eyes met and darted away, said everything we didn't. When he picked up an old Bible that needed restoring, he pulled out a crumpled sheet from inside and handed it to me, a draft of a song we wrote together as teenagers. He didn't smile. He just looked at me, his breath held, as if it were a point of no return. And it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I took out the old prayer journal where, years ago, I wrote more about him than about God, and reread every page like someone searching for a compass. In every word, there was pain, but also love. The kind of love that, even torn, remains whole. The kind of love that doesn't fade with distance, silence, or broken vows before an altar. The next morning, I went to the church before the service began. He was there, alone, as he often was, sitting in the last pew, as if he could watch without being seen. I approached slowly, and when he looked at me, I spoke with a voice that was more mine than ever. You can pretend you forgot, Isaac, but I can't pretend I don't remember anymore. He took a deep breath, lowered his eyes, and when he raised them there were tears there, not of regret, but of release. He simply said, "Neither can I." The silence that followed that confession was more eloquent than any sermon we'd ever heard. There, among wooden pews and memories that still smelled of adolescence, something broke, but it was a good break, a rupture of fear, of pretense, of that constant weight of pretending we'd moved on when, in truth, we were just frozen in time. We left the church together that morning, not touching, not promising anything, but certain we'd opened a door we couldn't close again. In the days that followed, our conversations grew more frequent. We walked through the market as if it were the first time, exchanging looks that no longer tried to hide what they felt. Sometimes we talked about the present, community duties, the routines of families we'd known forever. But inevitably the conversation turned to what we were, to what happened, to what shouldn't have ended the way it did. Isaac told me how he felt after I left, not just the pain of separation, but the sense that he'd been complicit in his own punishment. He said the vow to forget me wasn't made out of anger, but weakness. He thought that by burying my name with the memory, he could live with less pain. But he didn't live. He only survived, and that broke me. I opened my wounds, too. I spoke of how it felt to watch my family pretend nothing had happened, to be sent away without any right to say that love wasn't a sin. I spoke of the loneliness, the shame imposed on something that was born pure but treated as dirty. I spoke of how I tried to love other men, but always compared them to the way Isaac looked at me, listened to me, knew me without effort. And he listened to it all, without interrupting, without justifying, without running. But the town hadn't changed as much as we had. The whispers began, the questions disguised as concern, the looks from the same women who years ago stitched my reputation with sharp words. My father noticed before I had the chance to tell him. He called me to talk, his voice low but cutting. He said Isaac was a part of the past that needed to stay there, that some wounds shouldn't be reopened, that the community trusted in my reconstruction, and it would be a mistake to get involved again with someone who had led me astray. I listened silently. For the first time, I didn't argue, but I didn't back down either. That night, I went to Isaac's house. I knocked on the door with my heart racing, and when he answered, I looked deep into his eyes and said, "If you want to leave, I understand, but I won't pretend I don't love you anymore." He hesitated for a moment. Then with a voice both trembling and firm, he replied, "If you're ready to face everything, I never really left." The news spread like the wind, swift, invisible, inevitable. There was no official announcement, no need for explanations. It was enough that we were seen together 2 or 3 times more than was acceptable. A lingering touch on the arm leaving church, a look that lasted too long not to raise suspicions. The church that shaped us now seemed to bend against us, There was a different silence in the hallways, a kind of bitter prayer in the eyes of those who'd known us since childhood. But there was no room for retreat. Isaac and I no longer hid, not out of pride, but by choice. Our meetings became more than revisiting an old feeling. They became the foundation of a new story. He showed me the furniture he restored as if revealing a piece of his soul. I invited him for tea on my mother's porch, even knowing she looked at me as if I were about to stumble again. But I wasn't stumbling, I was walking. For the first time, I felt my steps firm on the ground that once cast me out. And the louder the voices around us grew, the stronger our silence became. We didn't need to justify ourselves. We were, at last, ready to live with open eyes and intertwined hands, even if the whole world said no. Because within us, the yes had been said long ago. The tension didn't take long to reach a boiling point. My father, who until then had avoided direct confrontation, called me to talk one late afternoon when the sky seemed heavier than usual. There was something in his posture, the way he held his coffee cup, the calculated silence between sentences, that made me realize this wasn't just a hurt father. It was also a man who felt betrayed by his own daughter for not following the path he deemed right. He said I was throwing away everything I'd rebuilt with effort, that my name, his reputation, our family's story deserved more than this regression. I listened, my chest tight, but I didn't bow. When I responded, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said I could no longer live in fear, that I'd already paid too high a price for a mistake that deep down was never a sin. And if loving someone who loves me back with truth and constancy was a mistake, then I was willing to make that mistake every day of my life. I left that house without slamming doors, but with my soul alight. I found Isaac at the workshop. He looked at me and without a word from me, knew something had changed. He hugged me right there, his hands dirty with wood and his heart clean of shame. For the first time in years, I felt I didn't have to choose between love and my story. I could carry them together. And as he held me, I realized what we were building now wasn't a continuation of what was left behind. It was a new home, built from the remnants of what we almost were, but grounded in the maturity of what we'd chosen to be. Weeks later, we were sitting side by side on a bench in the square across from the church, watching children play and old couples pass hand in hand, not saying a word. The sun warmed our backs gently, and the breeze carried that springtime mix of wood and freshly baked bread that always reminded me of childhood. Isaac held my hand with the same firmness he used on tools in the workshop, but with a tenderness found only in someone who's learned to lose and still chooses to love again. He looked at me with the calm eyes of someone no longer in a hurry and pulled a small, worn velvet box from his pocket, its edges frayed. It wasn't grandiose. There was no speech. He just said, his voice low and choked, "This time I won't promise to forget you. I'll promise to remember everything that brought us here and never let go of your hand again." I didn't cry. I just smiled, as if my whole heart had finally found a place to rest. And I said yes. A yes without fear, without guilt, without the need to hide. A yes before ourselves, time, and everything we'd endured. The wedding was simple, intimate, discreet, but not out of shame, by choice. We wanted that moment to be ours alone, like every step of this silent, courageous reconciliation. My father didn't attend, but my mother came. She brought trembling hands, a hesitant look, and at the end of the ceremony hugged me longer than I could remember. She didn't say she approved, but she also didn't say I was lost, and that was enough. Today, Isaac and I live in the same town where it all began and nearly ended. We walk to church together on Sundays, sit side by side, And sometimes when we sing the old hymns, our eyes meet and we smile, because we know what it costs to be there. I'm no longer just the pastor's daughter. He's no longer the man who swore to forget me. Now we're just us, rebuilt, redeemed, and whole. It's not time that heals. It's love chosen with courage. Today when I see Isaac laughing among shelves of wood and children running around, I know it was all worth it. Because what we live now isn't a return to the past. It's a new beginning, built not on perfect promises but on matured truths. We became two who lost each other too, soon, and found each other at the right time. He no longer needed to promise to forget me, and I at last could live love without fear of deserving it.